Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of the how to build and paint your very first fantasy house made entirely out of cardboard. At the end of the previous episode, the build episode, we base coated the entire house in brown. This gives us a nice flat medium to work up from now, as opposed to spraying priming it in black or white. But really, any paint that you have will work. In this case, we're going to be using primarily craft store paints, so your water-based and acrylic paints, as well as any modelling ones that you might have just lying around at home. Now, I will say this, you don't have to use the exact paints that I use in this video. This is just general guidance, so do not worry about trying to match it. Just if I'm using red, use a red. If I'm using brown, use a brown. Like whatever you're comfortable with, that's what matters. So we're just starting with the roof tiles, and we're going to paint those red. This is quite a nice messy bit because all we care about right now is just getting the colour where it needs to be, which is in between all the cracks, in between all the individual panels of these tiles. Don't worry about being perfect with this. A lot of this project has just been nice, relaxing, splatting the paint on there, because that's what this is all about. It's getting you cutting and sticking, and before you know it, making a fantasy village. So as you can see, doing one side takes no time at all, and the same can be said for the other. One thing that I would point out is a lot of the time you might think that you're putting too much or too little paint on. This is something that you'll pick up as you go along. It is advised to water paint down and apply multiple thin coats. In the case of this roof, I'm not overdoing it, but the pigment is not particularly strong in this craft paint. So in that case, just use multiple layers. Now, because the base of this house is a wooden panel design, the top, the first floor and the roof walls, we're going to do them in that sort of wattle and daub beige colour. And to do that, I've got this, just the last dregs of my beige craft paint, and we're going to splat some of that out onto our little palette. And then using not a particularly chunky paintbrush, but just a decent sized paintbrush, we're just trying to go around and cover the area in between the wood panels on the first floor. Now, if at any point you feel that you're not getting enough control over your paintbrush, like you can see it's going over and touching all the areas that we don't want it, you can just use a smaller brush. Use big brushes for covering the big areas, use smaller brushes for covering the smaller ones. Here we are after one layer, and as you can see, I've left out that wonderful little crisscross section that we did during the build video, and I'm using it again, a smaller brush, to get right up to the edges. Now, because of just how thin the pigment in this paint is, we are going to be doing multiple layers, which is advisable. But you might find in some areas that it's still very patchy, or you can still clearly see the brown underneath, but it's a lot easier than, say, if it was base coated black, because then it really would be very difficult to see, and it can change the colour as well. You get like a green kind of tint depending. But here you can see the second layer going on, and again using a larger brush to cover the large areas, and then using a smaller brush to cover the small areas. And here we are, this is actually after a third layer as well, to try and get as much of that beige in as we can. Now what we're going to do here is just quickly touch up over any areas of the beams where the beige paint went and we didn't want it to go yet. So using this Mordheim brown, we're just going to quickly go over those. And you can do this with any project. You know, if you find the paint's not going where you want it, just go back, just touch it up. It's fine. Now, a key I will say when painting something like a piece of terrain is, like with building it, don't worry too much about it being perfect. But likewise, do spend time going back and neatening things up. It doesn't have to be mathematically perfect, but this looks far more presentable now that I've gone back over it. Now, before we do any washes or anything like that, we're going to paint any metal areas. So as I showed during the build, these corners to the house, those are metal. I'm going to be using this Citadel lead belcher or bolt gun metal, and we're just again going over, painting a nice thin layer. At this point, you need to make the decision, all those little square rivets, are those going to be metal or are those going to be wood? Little wooden pegs holding the building together. In this case, I am going to paint them as metal. Again, just make sure it's a nice small brush that you've got good control over so you can get it where you want it. This will be the most time-consuming part, but it is by far the easiest as well. And, again, most satisfying, because look at that. Doesn't that look good already? We've applied, what, 3 colours to this? And already it looks pretty presentable. It's all about the details, boys and girls. Alright, so next step after this then is applying a wash. So what I like to do is I like to use a metal tray. This is the metal tray that I spray my models on, I do some hot gluing on, and this is the metal tray that when it comes to applying washes, I like to wash on, because if you just were to pour the wash straight onto it, it's clearly going to run down the sides and it's clearly going to run onto whatever surface it's stood on. Now I'm starting with a brown wash. This is a homemade craft wash, just using water, a little bit of brown paint and a small amount of washing up liquid. There's 101 videos on how to make a brown or a black wash on YouTube, so you do not need me to go over that. But as you can see, I'm doing a brown wash over these beige areas, primarily because if I was to touch those areas with a black wash, as I said with trying to paint over a black base coat, it's the same when applying over the top. You start to see a discoloration, and it's not a nice bit of shadow. It starts changing into a green or a grey, which is not what we want. Now if you see that the wash is pooling up in areas, dry your brush and just use it to quickly touch up and absorb the paint there, or absorb the wash. But after that is dried, you can see it's not had much of an effect on the roof, so let's go over the darker areas with the darker wash. So this is a black wash that again I've made out of black PVA paint, water and a little bit of dish soap. And already that is finding all the cracks, all the crevices, all the panel lines, and it is going to make those roof tiles stand out. It is going to artificially create the shadow in between the layers, and it will look really good when it's done. Now, something that I don't see a lot of people talking about is when it comes to making your own wash, what happens if you apply too much washing up liquid, too much dish soap. Well, here you can see in this shot, clearly something's gone weird because it started to foam up. That's fine, it'll still dry fine. You might find that it's dried in a strange pattern, like the bubbles of the foam have gone a bit wibbly. But as you can see, that's still dried okay. It's just well, if you've ever done washing up in your life, you know what happens. Water contacts the soap and it starts to foam. Well, same can be said here. That's why you're only meant to use a little bit of it, but it's okay if you use a bit more. So don't panic, you've not ruined a project if it starts to foam up. So now we're going to do some dry brushing, so I'm just going to take this nice, cheap, relatively abused chisel brush and using some Citadel red paint just go over all of the corners of these roof tiles. Now it might be a little difficult to see in the video, but trust me, it is lightening the edges of the tiles. We're then going to mix a little bit of this Citadel beige paint in with that to create a lighter, pinker colour, which again we're going to dry brush over the top. So there you can see that's standing out a lot more, which is good. And now we're going to dry brush all of the wood panels on the building. So again, using Citadel beige paint, but any beige will work. get a little bit on your brush. It doesn't have to be completely bone dry. It can be relatively loaded. Just sweep that along the edges, sweep that along the sides. We're trying to make this look like a worn and weathered house. You see a lot of these things and they look a bit dollhouse-like because they're a bit too clean and a bit too perfect. But reality is not perfect, my friend. So make it dirty, make it a bit gritty. And before you know it, it's going to look really good. And this whole process doesn't take very long. Waiting for the washes to dry and waiting for the acrylic paints to dry as opposed to our nice, high quality miniature paints, that's by far the longest time for this project. So here we're going to use, again, a nice medium sized brush, and we're going to use a lighter silver to just touch on the metal raised areas. And this helps separate things like the rivets from the base metal that they're set into. And then finally, which is something I've started doing with my builds, we're going to mix a little bit of dark green paint with quite a large amount of water, because we want it to be like a wash, but more controlled. What we're going to do is we're going to create a moss or algae-like effect, which would naturally grow in the cracks and in the corners of wooden beams and supports around the house, around the base, around anywhere where sunlight and the elements are left exposed. So as you can see, running along this beige panel, just going across the bottom and a little bit up the sides. And this isn't some super amazing technique, but this will really help just add just a little extra something, just a little bit more visual interest, which I think is important. One last trick I do like to do is a little bit of the water staining, a little bit of the dirty kind of the rain, the dry, horrible water marks that you get from when it's been raining particularly heavily. So that's simply done with mixing some brown paint with a lot of water, making a very thin wash, and just, as you can see here, I'm doing a little bit of a streak and then rubbing it a little bit with my finger. But we're trying to get these very thin lines going down the sides of the building. Now, you don't want a lot of these, like 1 or 2 will do you. But before you know it, you've made a very nice and very grungy and very medieval fantasy house. And as you can see, if we compare it to the one that I showed off briefly at the end of the last video, the construction video, this can be applied to anything. This can be applied to any building. And going forward with this tutorial series, this will be the video that I will reference whenever it comes to seeing the painted house at the end of it, because the technique is the same. The actual process is the same. There's nothing hidden. It's all, this is what you see is what you get. So if you follow these instructions, this is what you will receive. So I hope that you've enjoyed today's video. I hope you found this informative, and until next time, thank you for watching and have a good one. Happy crafting.